Okay, Mina, it's one of those questions that we ask ourselves, and often people do ask us. How come being an artist? I mean, all the forces would seem to militate against that. So, why did you become an artist, or what triggered the idea of making art?
I don't know that I ever decided to become an artist.
Hmm.
I think it just sort of happened, and maybe there weren't enough other things that I really loved to do that it kind of went out by default. But when I was a kid, I used to love it. I drew all the time. I would make things, and I think that it was, for me, this real place of escape where I could just kind of enter my own world and really think about stuff. But I never actually thought of it as something that I would do. And then I started to become interested in other things and think of them as careers and all of that. But I always made things, and I always just was very interested in that. And I don't know that the other things necessarily sustained me as much. I went to visual arts school. I did my undergrad at Western. And even in my first year, I wasn't really convinced that I wanted to be an artist. Because while I really enjoyed it, I just thought, can I sustain a whole life of this? Like, is there really enough that's kind of fruitful here that is going to keep me excited and interested? And then I remember in my second year, I got introduced to conceptual artists. I got introduced to the work of Marcel Duchamp and General Idea and the Guerrilla Girls and Judy Chicago, and I just thought, wow. If this is what art can be, if it can talk about these kinds of things and really invest itself deeply in these kinds of questions, I'm in. That's what I want to do. But it wasn't until then, until I realized that all of these kind of interests and all the things that I thought about were actually what art was.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, did they, in a sense, answer the question, what can an artist do, or what does an artist do?
I think so. Yeah, I think that was actually my big question, was, can it really do anything, was sort of the concern about whether or not I wanted to make my life this way. And I think they really did answer that question for me, and it made me realize that artists and art help us see things in ways that we wouldn't see them. And in some cases help us see things that we wouldn't even see. And that for me became really engaging, and it's a way of thinking through the world that is different from other forms of practice. So that became really engaging. And I also kind of felt, when I became really moved by pieces of work and felt like, wow, someone is having this conversation that I've been thinking about that I didn't think anyone else was having. Someone's asking these questions that I thought only I was asking. I actually felt like I was part of something. And I know it sounds kind of ridiculous, but it felt really hopeful. It gave me this kind of feeling of, oh, I'm connected somehow. I really belong somewhere. And I think artists actually, and art keeps you from being too settled and comfortable in what you think you know. And that questions get asked that you wouldn't necessarily ask. I found all of that really exciting.
Is it because there's more space around the question of what an artist is, as opposed to, as, say, a philosopher or a scientist?
I don't know. I think that art can really cover any topic, delve into any question, move into any space. And there was a real freedom in that for me that just seemed really exciting. And also, like, I wouldn't get bored. Like, I was never really the most logical or linear thinker. I always was going off on these tangents and just thinking, oh yeah, like, if this question just naturally progresses to another question, I can just follow that question. And I found that also pretty exciting. That it was kind of felt a little bit more natural in the way that it would unravel.
Okay, so if that's around the question of what an artist can do, or at least the freedom for an artist. Would you say that that within that freedom of that space, that there evolved a core concern?
For me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah, for
Can you
sure.
speak to that?
Sure. I mean, I think I have always been really interested and invested in how we connect, how we bond,
Mm-hmm.
and in sort of the question of intimacy and remoteness, of alienation and connection. And I started to really think about the physical body, and that we are all kind of bound by this physical body. We are all sentient beings bound by our corporeal reality. And that sort of started me really investigating the senses, the sentient nature of the human condition. So I think for the past 10 or 15 years, my work has really been deeply invested in thinking about how each particular sense operates, how it informs our identity, how it alters our interactions, and how it shapes our social and political perceptions. That this is how we gain information. This is how we see the world, is through the five senses. And that question became even more interesting to me as I started to think about the technology age. And of course, we've been developing technologies for hundreds of years, but thinking about, the world becoming more virtual. On the one hand, we're able to connect more than ever before. We do kind of span the globe more than we've ever been able to, but the nature of those connections has changed, and in some ways, the nature of our intimacies is being redesigned.
Mm.
They are certainly, we have easier access to connection and communication, but the nature of those communications has changed, and they are becoming estranged from a kind of direct, multi-sensorial experience. So that has me even more interested in the senses and what is gained or lost when we are more or less connected to sensorial experience. And I'd say that that interest or engagement has really driven my practice for a number of years now.
Take me to a particular work that you think would help us to investigate that concern.
Okay. Well, I think, I always start with this interest in how a sense works, how we kind of engage in hearing or seeing or smelling. And I started to research sound and listening devices. I became really interested in that. And I came across a whole bunch of listening devices that were developed during World War I, before ranging, before sonar. So each country had built basically an acoustic locator so that they could hear oncoming aircraft, enemy aircraft. And they were these crazy, now they look like these absolutely crazy, absurd objects, right? Gigantic 18-foot listening horns. And they would put someone out in a field attached to these giant listening horns waiting for the sound of enemy aircraft to arrive. And I thought that was such a compelling image. We can't see this thing, we know there's a threat, and this really acute sense of listening. And these horns are just so amazing, trying to magnify sound in this way. And I thought, wow, these were machines of war, they were built for war. And thinking about whether or not that experience of heightened listening that these listening horns afforded, that these acoustic locators afforded, could be kind of reappropriated now in a contemporary culture. And rather than being, being objects that were around fear of the other, that now they're kind of used for a reconnection or a bonding. So I decided to rebuild it. There aren't really many plans, there are lots of drawings, so I accumulated a whole bunch of different drawings, and I basically rebuilt a smaller scale listening horn. So the horns were 6 feet long. had this amazing capacity to amplify sound. After I built them, I was totally fascinated by how much they could amplify sound. And what happened when you put these headphones on and you almost became immersed in the sound of your environment as one becomes immersed in water when they're in a swimming pool. It just was completely compelling. Like, it really was fascinating. So anyway, I rebuilt these listening horns, and they wound up being part of a project for Beyond in Western New York at the Biennial. And they were installed on the front plaza of the Erie County Public Library in Buffalo. But what was interesting about that is that the curator was interested to situate them there because they were right across from the City Hall. And I had become fascinated by how much surveillance, invisible surveillance, had kind of kept us separate from one another. That it kind of created a little bit of this this insularity, because we all know we're surveilled, but it's not really that visible. So I wanted to kind of do a couple of things. I wanted to make the surveillance that we all feel absurdly visible, and see if at the same time this kind of ridiculous, playful object could help connect us, both to the act of listening and to one another. So with that project, I mean, I think it was really fun that it was a kind of fun, silly, absurd machine. And people would put on the earphones, and I think there were some really interesting comments around how, alive the city became once you really started to listen to the sounds. And that compelled me to actually make a portable version of the acoustic locator, and I would put it in my truck, and I would drive it around different cities, and I would set it up in parks and, downtown city cores. I would just kind of guerrilla set this thing up. And it was super neat because people would just sort of show up wondering what this thing was, and they would put on the listening horns, and it just felt like part of the community would come alive in a way that we sort of often don't pay attention to. And I think lots of interesting conversations happened from that piece, just around what it means to actually block so much sound out, and then try and reacquaint ourselves with actually hearing and listening. Yeah.
There's a kind of tie-in here between awe and wonder.
Yeah.
And humor.
Yes.
Comedy. So I'm kind of curious, do you see that tie-in operating in your work?
I do. I do, actually. And I think it's a few things. It's a kind of playfulness and absurdity that can kind of reconnect us to a couple of things. To a connection that you share as children, this kind of feeling of security that children have to just get to know one another and play with one another. But also that I think humor in particular is a way of getting close to very difficult things, very difficult topics, and allowing us to stay there for a little while longer because it's bearable. And particularly when I think about the things that scare me, which are estrangement, loneliness, isolation, disconnection, those kinds of things.
Let alone surveillance.
Let alone surveillance, fear of the other, these kinds of things. When I think about that condition, I need a reprieve to really get close and to really start to understand what it means. Also, when I think about mortality, which always comes when you are thinking about what it means to be a mortal being. That a little bit of humor and absurdity allows you to get close and just spend some time. Yeah. So I think that's how it operates in my practice.
There's another aspect of your work that you've been pursuing, which is the sense of smell.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious about the relationship between smell and these questions that we've just been discussing. Do you want to explore that?
Sure. I think the more I learned about smell, the more fascinated I became in using it as a tool of resistance and of bonding and of connection. smell is a little bit different than the other senses. It operates a little bit differently. I've been actually researching smell for almost 10 years now. Just the way that it functions is fascinating to me. So smell is one of the only senses, is the only sense that operates outside of the language center of the brain. And so when we smell a smell, we don't necessarily identify that smell through the word. What happens first is that it calls up in us all of the smell memories that we've banked, and then triggers off this kind of emotive, visceral response. And I think there's something unique in there, that it actually brings up affect before it brings up logic. And so I've become very interested to use smell in my practice.
You use the word affect, and I can't help but ask the question. There's a lot of theory around the question of affect.
Right.
And does this body of theory seem informative to you, or does it seem beside the point, or do you in fact have any particular relationship to that body of theory? In fact, what do you think about theory?
What do I think about theory? The question, what do you think about theory? I love theory. I love theory. I love reading theory. And I think, I teach as well, and there tends to be a little bit of resistance around theory with students often. And I think there can sometimes be this feeling that I don't want to make work about theory, and that we shouldn't be making work about theory. I don't think I make work about theory, but I think that reading theory, reading about other people's ideas and thoughts on how things function and operate, philosophies, really just helps me question the world and helps me work through how I feel about things, what I think about things. So I don't make work about theory, but I think that theory really informs the questions that I ask of myself, the way that I approach those questions, and so it has a very important place in my practice. It's just, I think that making objects, making work, is a form of investigation, and I think that reading and researching is another form of investigation. And all of those things come together in my practice.
There's theory, and then there's literature. Is there a tie-in between the two?
Well, again, I think it's all, it's all stuff I'm interested in, and it all informs the way I think and the way I perceive myself in the world. Literature I've always kind of seen as this odd reprieve from the heaviness of theory, while at the same time having the capacity to really investigate deeply, which I find exciting. And I love language. I've always been very, very in love with words and the way that they sound, the way that they feel when they roll off the tongue. And there is something incredible about a good piece of writing, a good piece of literature. I don't read literature a lot. I don't read fiction a lot because I don't have a lot of time to, but I tend to go on these little binges in the summer where I just read a ton of stuff, and I have writers that I really love. And I realize that part of what I love about this particular group of writers is the way that they present problems and personalities, the way that they present engagements and interactions. And again, that is a different way of seeing it and thinking about it and working through it.
You write yourself?
I do. I wouldn't say I'm a writer, but I've always written in the same way that when I was a kid I always drew and I always made things, I always wrote. And again, I think they're just different forms of expressing ideas. And not always does the written word serve me completely. Not always does an object serve me completely in terms of trying to work through what I'm thinking about something. And so they afford me different muscles to exercise in a way, different ways of questioning things. and they give rise to different types of questions as well. So the writing is also important for me in my practice. Yeah.
Well, I wonder, it occurs to me actually, Nina, that as you work across these specific practices, that I hear you looking for a means to articulate something. If this particular form doesn't properly articulate that, then perhaps this other one does.
Right.
And out of all this, there becomes a kind of cohering effort to penetrate the spaces that underlie, I don't know, conventional realities. Would that be true?
Yeah, I think so. It is a way of exploring through many different lenses. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Back to the question of what an artist can do.
Right. Yeah. Back to the question.
Speaking of artists, again, art history. That's another form of reading.
Yes.
Do you read art history, or does it strike you as interesting?
It does. I think what I find, I find some art history interesting and some not interesting at all, which I suppose is the case for everyone.
And how would that work out?
In terms of what I find interesting and what I don't. Well, I think I'm not so fascinated by particular art movements and canons and kind of necessarily how they functioned so much as I am what they grew out of. I'm really interested in what gave rise to these kinds of movements. What were they responding to? And I think the reason I find art history so interesting and thinking about previous artists' work is because they asked so many of the same questions that I ask now. So, I think about, I'm asking questions about what does it mean to communicate in an ever-evolving world where technology is constantly changing? How does that, technology is neither good nor bad, it's just moving and it's always changing the way that we perceive the world. So how does that affect the way that I engage? Well, Walter Benjamin was asking that question when he was talking about the first still photograph. Now that we're able to see a frozen image, how does that affect the way that we perceive the world? We're now able to study a face apart from, its movements and its action. We're actually able to see someone after they've passed. How does this affect our ideas of mortality? And these were really compelling questions. And I think they're very relevant to the questions that I'm asking now. How does the digital age and the virtual world and Second Life affect the way I perceive myself? So they're really relevant questions, and I want to know how they were asked before. What kinds of questions were asked? Where did they lead to? I think those things are all really worth investigating, and I think they make me feel very tied to a longer and deeper investigation that is far beyond me, that is far beyond, when I will stop asking it. That there is a very long conversation happening across time. Yeah. So I do find, in terms of history, the repetition of questions and how they get recontextualized and reproposed according to the way the world changes, quite fascinating and really informs my practice.
Well, you mentioned affect a few minutes ago, and there tends to be a feeling that somehow affect has been diminished as a result of social media, the digital world. Do you think that's true, or and in your own practice?
Right.
Do you find anything like that?
I don't know if affect has been diminished. I think perhaps the opportunities to engage affect have been diminished. Everything is quite fractured.
Turning to maybe, since we're talking about the digital age, we're obviously talking about an age, an epoch, as it were. And it's often The question is often asked for artists.
Yeah.
Is there a particular dominant discourse that we're part of, or zeitgeist that we need to pay attention to? In your own experience, do you think that the current age has a dominant discourse? Do you find it, as an artist, do you work within a dominant discourse or a sense that there's a zeitgeist?
I think there are more than one. I think there are a few discourses that are kind of currently happening that artists are investigating. But if I really thought about a kind of overreaching theme or thematic, it would seem to be this breaking of boundaries and binaries. That seems to be really prevalent right now. I think that particularly in art practice, there is now more than ever before, I think, a real acceptance of artists not really having an affiliation to one particular discipline, and not even staying within the discipline of visual practice. And I find that really exciting, that more and more I think these relationships between artists and scientists and architects and designers and mathematicians, that these kinds of borders are being crossed a little bit more. And there's also, I think, an understanding that, particularly in a kind of political context, if we are going to make some headway politically and really kind of have resistant movements as well, that we actually have to think beyond any one particular discipline and start seeing how all of these things operate together. So more than ever before, I think we're kind of stepping outside of our own practices or discipline. I think, there's a couple of different things. I think that some of the work I do still operates within the gallery and the White Cube, and that has a very particular kind of audience, perhaps one that is more deeply invested in art discourse, particular art discourses, and there are certain kinds of conversations that can happen inside the White Cube that may not be able to happen anywhere else. I think there's a portion of my practice that works in that space. But of course, because my work is so interested in thinking through how we connect, where are these little places where we can actually claim agency and bond in ways that are not prescribed or dictated by any other body, that I want the work to actually naturally make its way into the public sphere and not even necessarily be recognized as an artwork. At that point, I think it really becomes, is there a space that I can open up where the public, citizens, the members of the community can engage in a way that may be different or unfamiliar, and that there's a curiosity around engaging in a new way, that there's a curiosity around a space that is not quite a recognizable space, that doesn't have a function that is as predetermined as we're used to. And so it's really just about that curiosity and that playfulness and that openness to experience that is an audience I'm really looking for and hoping to engage with. And I think it exists. I think people are generally curious. So it doesn't necessarily have to be linked directly to an art discourse, but I think ultimately it kind of can wind up there and be a very important component of that.
Do you enjoy teaching? Do you find your relationship to the students to be enriching? Something that is there for both the student and for yourself?
Yes. I love teaching. I actually have come to love it more than I ever thought I would. And I think it's a few things. I think, I'm really fortunate to teach in an arts-dedicated university where the students are really, really driven, very excited by what they do, and very engaged. And I also teach in a program that considers sculpture really broadly and very experimentally, and really supports this kind of thinking. So I think, there's a really nice alignment between the program in which I teach and my own practice and my own way of approaching practice. But I think some of the things I love most about teaching are that, and lots of instructors will say this, that they learn as much from their students as hopefully their students learn from them.
Mm-hmm.
But they are, I feel like I am constantly being challenged by the questions put to me by the students, and constantly being excited and enriched by their work and by their practices and by their responses to whatever it is we read or talk about or think about. So it's a really beautiful way to keep myself steeped in the conversations that excite me. And to, again, I think I said at the very beginning that, one of the things that art does is it can really prevent you from settling too comfortably in what you think you know. Well, if anything does that, teaching does that. And students will always ask me questions that I haven't actually ever considered, that I have no idea of the answer to. And so we kind of go through this process of working through answers together, which is really exciting. So on that level, I really enjoy it. I think it's a very, very engaging experience and is always calling up new issues and thoughts and questions. But what I realize is a huge part for me as well, and this may be partly because I have small classes and there's studio classes and seminar classes. I have this small group of students that I work with, and we really get to know each other. And if we're going to get to anything important or interesting in the work, we have to come up with a way of trusting one another and coming up with a kind of environment where everybody feels comfortable to speak and confident that everybody else is sort of on their side. And I just think I often come away from teaching with this real sense of camaraderie and a contentment around the fact that there is this desire for a community to really build these relationships and support one another and exercise that muscle of, can I say something and feel that I'm gonna be okay in saying that and that I trust these people. So those kinds of things are really important to me in teaching as well, and are a significant part of what makes it so enjoyable for me.
I'm kind of curious as I hear you speak, whether that extends to the world with a professional artist, which of course is in many ways dominated by the curator.
Right.
And what is your experience of working with curators?
Well, what is my experience of working with curators? I've worked with a variety of different curators that have many different approaches to working. Some that work better for me than others. I think there are times when I feel that I am being positioned into a particular spot by a curator, that there is something in particular I am being brought in to speak about, and that there may be some agenda around how I speak about that thing. And in that instance, I can find the relationship with the curator difficult. It's not always bad, because sometimes it does give rise to new ways of thinking through your work and new kinds of approaches to things. So sometimes it can be good, but it is a more difficult or maybe a less natural kind of relationship for me.
Is that because of a certain politics?
Could be. Could be because of a certain politics, yes. And then I find that there are curators that I also just sort of naturally start talking to about my work before any conversation around a show, before any conversation around, any kind of event. And with curators who I feel I've really been able to talk about my work with over the years, they really do help to inform my practice in a very interesting way. And I think when the relationship is really at its best, it's when that is a kind of collaborative event where I am developing ideas and curators are are asking me questions about how does that work, and how is that going to work, and have you thought about this, and how does it position itself here and there. And so it can be a really great relationship as well. But they're all different. It's about, it can be about a particular project, and because my projects are taking longer and longer to produce now, these relationships seem to go on longer. So I've had, conversations with curators over a number of years. One in particular I've kind of been talking to about my work ever since I started delving into smell, because he's particularly interested in sensorial practices as well. So even though he doesn't necessarily always function for me in the role of the curator, specifically around hosting an exhibition of my work, we seem to carry on this conversation even outside of that. And I think it's, the perspective of the curator in that instance is really interesting and very, very beneficial.
Turning from curating to critical writing or criticism, is there a particular function of criticism, or a particular critical inquiry, or a particular way of writing criticism, either directed towards yourself or towards others, that you feel is most productive?
I'm not really sure how I feel about that question, actually. I think when I read, and I assume that you're speaking specifically now about when someone is addressing a particular work or a particular body of work. I'm never so interested in whether they like the work, whether they think it's good or bad necessarily, but I am very interested in terms of how it gets positioned, how they see it fitting into a larger conversation, and what it can bring to that larger conversation. And I think that that the art critic can really do that in a very interesting way, can put a lens to the work. And that sometimes the work kind of lives on through that, right? Maybe it was initially produced to have a particular kind of conversation, but then once it enters a different sort of conversation and gets reframed, it can be considered in another way. And I think that is always very interesting to me. What are the multiple lenses through which this work can be seen, and what are the problems with it as well? I think all work, even though we try to resolve our works as artists, they're active, and they're inside of an active environment. So there's always a push-pull where the work, functions very well, but it also calls up issues and gives rise to new problems. So it's interesting to have the work challenged in that way as well, I think.
I'm thinking of your interest in odor, smell, and this space that is perhaps for many unfamiliar. And of course that's one of your reasons for being interested.
Right.
And I just wonder if you found certain critics are more responsive to that and others less responsive.
Yes, for sure. I think, there's a couple of things that are interesting about that. I think that there still is a little bit of how is this art? How is this, what is this really that you're doing? There is a little bit of a question of how it functions at times. But then the other thing I think sometimes is true, where I am a little bit skeptical of a response that seems too interested because it's working in olfaction, which is relatively new in practice. So I actually almost forgot your original question. What was that? Can we go back there? Sorry.
Critics.
Oh, yeah.
Essentially, the response of critics to the interests you have.
Right, in smell. Yeah, I think there's a curiosity about it for sure, and it is still relatively new in art practice. And like I said, sometimes that can make, I think this happens with every new kind of medium as well, right? That there seems to be this surge of interest in something, but without really going so deeply into how it's functioning and what purpose it's actually serving. So I think sometimes there can be more interest in the work because it situates itself in the realm of olfaction, and other times a real resistance to it because there isn't really a lot of work and discourse around it in art practice to draw from to really kind of position it.
when one raises the curator and the critic, it's almost inevitable that one raises the question of the art scene,
Sure.
of the
Yeah.
of the arena in which artists work, and the various levels of response or lack of response that works within the scene. Do you have any thoughts about how the scene functions in terms of, perhaps in terms of the curator and the critic as central elements within that, perhaps of course the gallery system and so on and so forth?
Right.
What do you think of the art system, I guess? Particularly how it's working now.
Right. And in Canada, I would assume.
And in Canada.
Yeah. You know, again, I mean, I think as anything, there are places where I think it's opening up in a really exciting way, and there are places where it still needs a lot of work. So, you know, there are certain things that excite me, and maybe we'll focus on those. But I think that that there again is a kind of opening up of what art practice actually can be and is, and that there are many more venues than simply the commercial gallery or the museum now. I think that we're getting a lot of traction in terms of even larger funding bodies recognizing the kinds of work that operates outside of those distinctions. And even though some of the funding bodies are having trouble keeping up with trying to figure out how they, you know, position certain practices, I think there is at least an interest in trying to do that. And I think that's great and exciting. You know, I like that there are many more venues now than ever before, that the Artist Run Center is really kind of taking hold, and artists are, you know, doing that kind of thing quite a bit. That there are little galleries popping up everywhere and events, and I think that is all kind of taking off in an exciting way. I do think still, though, that there is a limited voice that is heard in the art scene, and we're aware of it, I think, more so than we used to be. And I think in places there are strides where we're really trying to make a change there, but for the most part, you know, it still really is held by a white male voice. And, you know, I think there needs to be some addressing of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is the deep politics of the art system.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, it is deeply embedded. It's deeply ingrained in the way that all of these structures were built, right? So it makes sense that it would take a little bit of time to readjust. But I think there's an impatience, I think, around that. And it's going to have to start to change a little bit more quickly.
Back to the Guerrilla Girls.
Yeah.
It's hard to be an artist.
It is.
I've heard. There are a lot of sacrifices apparently involved.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean to joke about that. There are a lot of sacrifices involved. Around the question of making it, as they say, and around the question of sheer perseverance.
Right.
And in terms of the effect it has on those around you.
Right.
So I won't go into all the messy details of what all that, of course, brings to mind. But in your own case, Nina, when you found yourself actually practicing as an artist in this extended sense that you talk about, nonetheless, as an artist, in this space that is rather unique to being an artist,
Right.
It takes a lot of toughness to stay there. And a lot of, perseverance.
Right.
Is there anything you would like to say about that? I don't mean to, of course, make that an investigation of your private concerns, but
Right.
just any reflections that you have on the question of the perseverance required to be an artist.
Right. Well, it is certainly something, I can only speak for myself in this instance, but it's something I've asked myself a number of times. And there have been probably 3 significant points in my life where I've thought, I really got to give this up. This is costing a lot. and I just don't know if I can keep doing this and really put together at the same time the kind of life that I want to have. And I think that what happened is every time I tried to give it up or not practice, I would sort of lose it a little. Like I would just come a little bit unglued, if I'm going to be honest. So I think that probably in terms of difficulty for the people around me, they started to realize that maybe it's less difficult when I'm actually doing this stuff, because it just keeps me grounded. So there's certainly that. But I think in terms of perseverance, as my practice has evolved and become more collaborative, that has absolutely helped me persevere, because I feel much more connected. I'm not so isolated anymore, and I feel like I am not always having to motivate myself on my own all the time. There is something really significant about working with other people who have a different kind of energy and excitement to a project, and that it feels like this collaborative experience. That has helped me persevere quite a bit. That has really, I think, sustained the practice for me in a way that it may not have had I have stayed working solely as a kind of studio artist. So that's been a significant thing. But it just brings me a lot of joy, and I think I've actually just found avenues to make my life work, found a real job in teaching that, allows me to live and earn a living and still feel like I'm doing what I want to do.
Joy.
That's
I have a
it.
question.
Yeah.
And it leads out a little bit of what you just said. The question of originality, the original artist, the authentic artist
Yeah.
in the old-fashioned sense,
Sure.
working away in the studio and producing something of value, whatever that means, has in some respects been called into question politically. I don't know whether you can call it postmodern or not, but
Right.
and I guess as a result of the various critical incursions into this question, what is an artist, and what is its value, if you
Right.
want, or how does it function? Anyway, I'm kind of curious about this question of joy.
Yeah.
And how it relates to what we might, almost in an old-fashioned sense, call the authenticity that one strives for,
Right.
or historically artists have striven for. So, how would you see this question of the authentic from the context that you were just describing, and perhaps in terms of what would constitute an authentic practice today?
An authentic practice. I mean, to be honest, I find that to be a slippery word, authentic. I'm not sure I really know what that means. So maybe I'll just interpret the word in the way that I see fit and respond to that interpretation. Because authenticity and originality are often connected as well. And I don't think I've really ever had much... I don't spend a lot of time thinking about originality in art practice, because again, as I said to you, I'm fascinated and interested and comforted by the fact that some of the questions I have already been asked a million times, but they're always asked in a different way. They're always asked in a different context, and they're always asked through a different point of perspective. So that question doesn't really trouble me very much. In terms of kind of authenticity of art practice, I mean, I think in a larger view, the type of inquiry that is afforded to artists, the process of inquiry, is very specific to a deep investigation that one devotes one's life to, that happens through practice. And that when those kinds of inquiries and approach to questioning are brought to other things, they have extreme value, because they can only be asked in that way through this kind of practice. So there is a kind of authenticity of inquiry, I think, that art practice can bring to things. And that for me is exciting and interesting and joyful.